The Galactic Defense Coalition had a wonderful tradition of putting humans in charge of absolutely nothing important, then acting surprised when everything went sideways. It was a time-honored practice, really, like giving a toddler safety scissors and expecting them to perform neurosurgery, except the toddler occasionally succeeded and made everyone else look incompetent. Lieutenant Commander Hadrix, General Hadrix now, because apparently surviving 3 minor skirmishes qualified as tactical genius in the current military climate, stood behind his crystalline desk like a monument to bureaucratic incompetence. His scales shifted from emerald to amber, which any xenobiologist worth their salt knew meant he was either deeply pleased or about to lay eggs. Given the circumstances, betting odds favored the former. Lieutenant, he hissed, his translator rendering the Saurian clicking into something resembling Galactic Standard. How delightful to see you again. The human officer standing at attention before him had the distinct pleasure of being exactly the kind of problem Hadrix loved to solve with extreme prejudice. She was competent, a cardinal sin in the GD. Worse, she was competent in ways that made her superiors look like they'd earned their ranks through a combination of nepotism and spectacular luck, which, to be fair, most of them had. Her service record read like a cautionary tale about what happened when you gave humans actual responsibility. 3 successful defensive actions, 2 brilliant tactical retreats that had saved entire battalions, 1 incident involving improvised explosives, a cargo bay full of kitchen supplies, and what military historians would later classify as aggressive problem-solving. The kind of record that should have earned her a promotion and a commendation. Instead, she got General Hadrix's personal attention, which was roughly equivalent to being selected for a free colonoscopy performed by someone with Parkinson's. I have a special assignment for you, Hadrix continued, his tail sweeping across the floor with the satisfaction of a predator who'd cornered particularly appetizing prey. Something that requires your unique, human perspective. Translation: something suicidal that he could blame on human recklessness when she inevitably died doing it. The holographic display behind him flickered to life, revealing what could generously be described as a fortress and more accurately described as a geometric middle finger extended toward anyone stupid enough to approach it. The Zarathi stronghold sat atop a mountain that had clearly been chosen for its resemblance to an impregnable nightmare. Sensor arrays bristled from every surface like the spines of an irritated porcupine. Defense platforms floated in perfect formation, their energy signatures bright enough to blind a satellite. Intelligence suggests the Zarathi are planning something significant from this location, Hadrix said, gesturing toward the display with one clawed appendage. We need eyes on the ground. A small, fast reconnaissance team to penetrate their defenses and gather actionable intelligence. The lieutenant studied the display with the expression of someone reading their own obituary. The approach routes were a joke, assuming the joke involved threading a needle while blindfolded, riding a unicycle and being shot at by professionals. The fortress itself was a masterpiece of paranoid architecture, designed by someone who clearly believed that if you weren't using enough firepower, you weren't using enough firepower. Sir, she said carefully, the defensive grid alone would require at least a battalion-strength assault to penetrate. The approach vectors are completely exposed and their sensor coverage extends 40 kilometers in every direction. A small reconnaissance team wouldn't make it within 10 clicks of the perimeter. Hadrix's scales shifted to a pleasant gold color that managed to convey both condescension and barely contained glee. Nevertheless, Lieutenant, these are your orders. You'll depart at 0. Solo mission, naturally. We can't risk a larger force. Solo, of course. Because nothing said reconnaissance mission like sending one person to scout a fortress that could probably repel a small fleet. The kind of mission that would result in either complete success or a very small crater, with absolutely no middle ground. Understood, sir. The lieutenant's voice carried the flat professionalism of someone who'd just been handed a death sentence wrapped in military jargon. Will there be any support elements? Artillery coordination? Extraction protocols? Oh, I'm sure you'll think of something. Hadrix replied with the sort of smile that suggested he'd already written the casualty report. Humans are so creative when their backs are against the wall. Consider it an opportunity to showcase that famous human ingenuity we hear so much about. The dismissal was clear, but the lieutenant remained at attention for a moment longer, studying the holographic fortress with the intensity of someone memorizing their killer's face. Every sensor array, Every gun emplacement, every possible approach route, all of it filed away in the peculiar human talent for turning impossible situations into merely improbable ones. Outside Hadrix's office, the corridor buzzed with the usual military efficiency that characterized a headquarters far from any actual fighting. Staff officers hurried between meetings where they would discuss the theoretical implications of combat they'd never seen. Analysts pored over reports about battles they'd never fight. The whole place reeked of the particular kind of competence that looked impressive on organizational charts and got people killed in real life. The lieutenant's boots echoed against the deck plating as she made her way toward the enlisted quarters. Behind her she could practically feel Hadrix's satisfaction radiating through the bulkheads like heat from a reactor. He'd finally found a way to solve his human problem, without the messy paperwork of an actual court-martial, elegant, efficient, completely deniable. What the good general hadn't counted on was the peculiar human tendency to treat impossible odds as a personal insult rather than a death sentence, or the fact that competent leadership, regardless of species, had a way of inspiring loyalty that transcended military hierarchy. The lieutenant turned the corner toward her quarters, unaware that her entire platoon had been listening to every word of her death sentence through the ventilation system, and that they were already making plans that would give General Hadrix a very different kind of headache than he'd anticipated. After all, humans weren't the only ones who got unreasonably attached to officers who actually knew what they were doing. The lieutenant had always prided herself on understanding the fine art of tactical withdrawal, a skill that in military circles was politely called strategic repositioning, and less politely called running like hell. Her current plan fell solidly into the latter category, with the added complexity of trying to sneak out of a military installation without anyone noticing. She'd packed light emergency rations, basic medical supplies, enough ammunition to make her death moderately inconvenient for whoever caused it, and a resignation letter that would be delivered posthumously. The kind of gear selection that screamed suicide mission to anyone with basic pattern recognition skill. The cargo bay airlock had always been her preferred route for unofficial departures. It was poorly monitored, generally ignored by security, and had the virtue of being far enough from the command center that explosions wouldn't damage anything important. Perfect for the sort of exit that wouldn't reflect well on anyone's service record. What she hadn't expected was to find her entire platoon waiting for her in full combat gear. Going somewhere, Lieutenant. The voice belonged to Petty Officer Finn, her second in command and the kind of human who'd somehow managed to survive 3 tours without losing either his sense of humor or his complete disregard for military hierarchy. He stood with arms crossed, wearing the expression of someone who'd caught their teenager sneaking out for a party. Behind him stood the rest of her motley collection of military misfits, each one armed and looking entirely too pleased with themselves. Echo, the Manthari communications specialist, clicked her mandibles in what passed for amusement among insectoid species. Her compound eyes reflected the bay's harsh lighting like disco balls, creating the unsettling impression of being watched by a very large, very armed bug, who found the situation hilarious. Blaze hovered near the ceiling, his energy form crackling with barely contained excitement. The Etherean's natural state was somewhere between living plasma and controlled nuclear reaction, which made him excellent at breaking things and terrible at stealth operations. His presence suggested this wouldn't be a quiet extraction. Granite stood motionless near the cargo containers, his rocky exterior making him nearly invisible until he chose to move. The Terran, not to be confused with human Terrans because the galaxy had apparently run out of creative names, was roughly the size and consistency of a small mountain, with the personality to match. When Granite decided to follow someone, it was less a decision and more a geological event. Whisper occupied the psychological space between definitely present and probably somewhere nearby, which was about as specific as anyone could get with a sign. The telepathic species had evolved privacy as an art form, making them simultaneously the most and least trustworthy members of any unit. Her mental voice carried the distinct flavor of smug satisfaction that suggested she'd been reading everyone's thoughts again. Stand down, the lieutenant said with the authority of someone who knew her orders would be completely ignored. This is a solo mission. Direct orders from General Hadrix. Funny thing about orders, Finn replied, checking his rifle with the casual competence of someone who'd been breaking regulations since basic training. They have to be legal to be binding. And sending an officer on a mission with 0 probability of success and no extraction protocol. That's not orders, LT. That's murder with paperwork. Echo's mandibles clicked in rapid succession. the Manthari equivalent of applause. Her translator rendered it as enthusiastic agreement with several anatomical suggestions regarding General Hadrix's ancestry. The device had clearly been programmed by someone with a sense of humor and no respect for military decorum. Besides, Blaze added, his voice carrying the crackling undertones of controlled lightning, we've got nothing better to do. The alternative is sitting around the barracks listening to the brass debate tactical theory while the enlisted do the actual work. Again, the lieutenant felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling across her shoulders like a lead blanket. These weren't just soldiers, they were her soldiers. The kind of military family that formed when competent people found themselves surrounded by institutional incompetence and decided to survive through mutual stubbornness. This isn't a debate, she said, though her tone lacked the conviction necessary to sell the lie. I'm giving you a direct order to remain on base and await further instructions. From who? Whisper's mental voice carried sardonic amusement. The same command structure that just ordered you to commit suicide. I don't think we'll be waiting around for their next brilliant strategic insight. Granite rumbled agreement, the sound reverberating through the cargo bay like distant thunder. His species communicated primarily through subsonic vibrations, which meant most conversations with him felt like standing next to construction equipment. The translator rendered his contribution as orders stupid, friends more important than protocol, which was, the lieutenant realized, probably the most succinct summary of military philosophy she'd ever heard. You're talking about desertion, she pointed out, though the argument felt increasingly academic. Court-martial, imprisonment, the complete destruction of your military career. What careers? Finn laughed, the sound carrying 3 tours worth of disillusionment with military advancement. We're expendable ground troops in an organization that treats humans like ammunition and non-humans like exotic ammunition. Our career prospects peaked at survived longer than expected. The truth of it hit like a physical blow. The GDC's promotional structure was less a ladder and more a revolving door that occasionally crushed people on the way through. Officers who showed actual competence were quietly transferred to increasingly dangerous assignments until statistics solved the problem. Enlisted personnel who demonstrated independent thinking were labeled discipline problems and given appropriately hazardous duty. Her platoon represented every species the galaxy considered expendable, united by the common experience of being competent in an organization that rewarded mediocrity. They'd followed her not because of her rank, but because she'd kept them alive when following orders would have gotten them killed. The fortress is heavily defended, she said, making one last attempt at rationality. The mission parameters are suicide. You'll die for nothing. Maybe, Echo clicked, her compound eyes reflecting thoughtful calculation. But we'll die doing something that matters, instead of rotting away in the barracks while incompetents make decisions about our lives. Besides, humans aren't the only species that gets unreasonably stubborn when someone tries to dispose of us. And Blaze added with electrical enthusiasm, when's the last time any of us got to blow something up without filling out requisition form? The lieutenant looked around the cargo bay, studying the faces and face equivalents of soldiers who decided to follow her into certain death rather than watch her die alone. It was exactly the kind of irrational loyalty that military academies taught was theoretically impossible and practically invaluable. This is insane, she said, though she was already calculating approach vectors and tactical options. We're talking about infiltrating a fortress that could repel a battalion with 6 people and whatever equipment we can carry. 7, Granite corrected, his subsonic rumble carrying gentle amusement. Counting is important in tactical planning. 7 people against an impregnable fortress, with no support, no extraction, and no backup plan. Whisper's mental laugh felt like champagne bubbles in her consciousness. You say that like it's a bad thing. When has this unit ever had proper support, extraction, or backup plan? At least this time we're choosing our own impossible odds. The lieutenant felt something shift in her chest, the familiar sensation of a decision crystallizing into inevitability. Her soldiers were right. The mission was suicide whether she went alone or took them with her. But going together meant they'd die as a unit, which was somehow infinitely preferable to dying as a statistic in general. Hadrix's personnel reports. Gear up, she said, and felt the words settle into place like puzzle pieces. Full combat load.
We leave in 20 minutes. The cargo bay exploded into controlled chaos as her platoon began final preparations for what everyone understood would likely be their last mission. But they moved with the enthusiasm of people who'd finally found something worth dying for, the chance to give General Hadrix a very different kind of headache than he'd planned. After all, if you were going to commit mutiny, might as well do it in style.
The Zerathi fortress had been designed by someone with a deep appreciation for intimidation and an apparently unlimited budget for defensive systems. It squatted on its mountain peak like a metallic cancer, bristling with enough firepower to sterilize several city blocks, and the attitude to match. The kind of installation that made military planners break out in cold sweats and reach for their emergency alcohol reserves. Which made it all the more embarrassing that the lieutenant's suicide squad had been watching it for 6 hours without seeing a single patrol. Are we sure this is the right fortress? Finn whispered, his voice barely carrying through the comm system. Because either we're looking at the galaxy's most secure meditation retreat, or someone's been seriously overselling this place. The lieutenant adjusted her scope and swept the perimeter again, confirming what her tactical brain refused to accept. The defense grid was active, sensors hummed with electronic vigilance, weapon systems tracked preset patterns with mechanical precision, but the fortress itself showed about as much actual activity as a particularly well-armed mausoleum. Thermal scans show maybe 30 life signs, Echo reported, her mandibles clicking with professional bewilderment. The installation is rated for a garrison of 300. Either they're having a really spectacular plague, or someone's been cutting the defense budget. Blaze flickered with electrical amusement from his position overlooking the main approach. Maybe they heard we were coming and decided to take a vacation. I hear the beaches on Andoria are lovely this time of cycle. Unlikely, Whisper's mental voice carried the dry precision of someone reading thoughts across several miles. The defenders are present, but they're confident. Overconfident. Overconfident, actually. They believe their fortress is impregnable, so they've settled into routine maintenance rather than active defense. It was, the lieutenant realized, exactly the kind of tactical arrogance that got armies destroyed by smaller, more motivated forces. The Zerathi had built themselves an unassailable position, and then promptly forgotten that unassailable positions were only unassailable if someone was actually defending them properly. Granite, she subvocalized into her comm. What's your assessment of the structural weaknesses? The massive Terran's response rumbled through the mountain's geological substrate, his species' unique ability to communicate through stone making him the perfect reconnaissance asset for mountainous terrain. Foundation is solid, but support pillars show stress fractures from poor maintenance. Blast here, he transmitted coordinates. An entire defensive section becomes expensive rubble, which raised the question, how did you assault an impregnable fortress that was apparently being defended by a skeleton crew of complacent professionals? The answer, as it turned out, involved a great deal of improvisation and the peculiar human tendency to turn architectural features into weapons. The approach the lieutenant had planned involved every dirty trick she'd learned in 3 years of keeping idiots alive, despite their best efforts to die gloriously. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified main entrance, they'd go through what the Zerathi had assumed was completely inaccessible, straight up the mountain face where no sensible military force would ever attempt an assault. Of course, her platoon had never been accused of being particularly sensible. Granite made the initial ascent look easy, his rocky fingers finding purchase on surfaces that would challenge a mountain goat with suicidal tendencies. Behind him, the rest of the team followed paths that existed primarily in the lieutenant's imagination and Granite's geological expertise. Blaze provided illumination and occasional controlled explosions when the terrain needed adjustment. Echo monitored communications and provided running commentary on the creative profanity emerging from various species as they attempted rock climbing in full combat gear. This is definitely not covered in the manual, Finn muttered, hauling himself over a particularly vindictive ledge. Pretty sure the manual specifically mentions avoiding exactly this kind of insanity. The manual was written by people who never had to assault a fortress with 7 soldiers and a prayer, the lieutenant replied, checking her own grip on stone that seemed determined to achieve independence from the rest of the mountain. Besides, when has this unit ever done anything the manual way? They'd made it halfway up the mountain face when Whisper's mental alarm crackled through their consciousness like cold lightning. Patrol coming, 2 guards, casual sweep. They'll pass directly beneath us in 3 minutes. The lieutenant pressed herself against the rock face, feeling the mountain's geological indifference to her predicament. Below them, 2 Zerathi soldiers emerged from what had appeared to be solid stone, a concealed entrance that explained how the fortress had seemed so understaffed. The guards moved with the relaxed pace of professionals going through mandatory motions, their attention focused more on their conversation than their surroundings, which was their first mistake. Their second mistake was walking directly beneath a team of soldiers who'd been trained by someone with an intimate understanding of gravity's tactical applications. Granite's descent was less a fall and more a controlled avalanche with malicious intent. His rocky bulk struck the first guard with the sound of architecture attempting to become geography. The second guard had just enough time to look up before Blaze converted himself into a directed lightning strike that left nothing but smoking boots and the lingering smell of ozone. Well, Finn observed, rappelling down to examine the results. That was efficient, and probably visible from orbit. The concealed entrance proved to be the fortress's main weakness, a maintenance tunnel that connected the defensive perimeter to the primary installation. The kind of structural necessity that military engineers included for practical reasons and tactical planners ignored because acknowledging it would require admitting their impregnable fortress had a back door. The lieutenant's team moved through the tunnel system with the careful efficiency of people who understood that overconfidence was contagious and potentially fatal. The Zerathi had built their fortress to repel major assaults from predictable directions. They hadn't planned for a small team that approached problems with creative applications of physics and a complete disregard for architectural intention. Emergency lighting cast everything in shades of red that made the tunnel system look like the digestive tract of something unpleasant. Echo's compound eyes adapted to the spectrum shift with insectoid ease, while Blaze dimmed his natural luminescence to avoid advertising their presence. Whisper monitored the mental emanations of the fortress's occupants, providing real-time intelligence on guard positions and general awareness levels. 27 confirmed hostiles, she reported through their mental link. They're conducting routine maintenance on the defense group. No one's noticed the perimeter breach yet, which brought them to the fortress's central command center, where the lieutenant's tactical assessment underwent rapid revision. The Zerathi hadn't skimped on their defensive systems. The room buzzed with enough electronic sophistication to coordinate the defense of an entire planet. Holographic displays showed sensor coverage, weapon tracking, and threat assessment protocols that would make a seasoned admiral weep with envy. It was being operated by 3 technicians who were clearly more interested in their card game than their duty station. I'm starting to understand why General Hadrix thought this was a suicide mission, Finn whispered, studying the defensive displays with professional appreciation. Anyone attacking this place conventionally would need a The lieutenant nodded, watching the card players with the focused attention of a predator studying particularly oblivious prey. But no one's attacking conventionally. They're attacking with human, which meant attacking with the species that had turned improvisation into an art form, tactics into suggestions, and impossible odds into personal challenges. The species that looked at an impregnable fortress and immediately started calculating how much explosive would be needed to make it considerably more pregnable. The assault on the command center lasted approximately 30 seconds, and involved innovative applications of electrical discharge, gravitational acceleration, and the tactical deployment of surprise. When the smoke cleared, the fortress's defensive grid was under new management. 3 Zerathi were enjoying involuntary unconsciousness, and the lieutenant was staring at tactical displays that showed exactly why General Hadrix had considered this mission impossible. Echo, she said, studying the communication logs with growing amazement. Are you seeing this? The Manthuri's mandibles clicked with excitement as she interfaced with the Zerathi systems. Command coordination for the entire sector, fleet movements, supply lines, strategic planning. Her translator rendered the clicking as increasingly rapid excitement. Lieutenant, this isn't just a fortress, it's the regional command center. Which meant they hadn't just infiltrated an impregnable defensive position. They'd accidentally captured the headquarters of an entire enemy military district, along with the commanding officer who was currently secured in what had been the fortress's most secure detention cell, and was now their most valuable prisoner. The lieutenant stared at their accidental prize, feeling the universe's sense of humor settling around her shoulders like a familiar coat. They'd come expecting to die gathering basic intelligence, and instead walked away with enough strategic information to shift the balance of an entire military campaign. So, Blaze asked, crackling with electrical satisfaction,
What do we do for an encore? The GDC headquarters landing bay had seen many things in its operational history: supply runs, personnel transfers, the occasional dignitary who'd gotten lost and needed directions to somewhere more important. What it had never seen was a stolen Zerathi transport ship arriving unscheduled with a cargo hold full of strategic intelligence, and the kind of swagger that usually preceded court-martial proceedings. The lieutenant's team disembarked with the casual confidence of people who'd just turned an impossible mission into an embarrassing victory for their enemies. Behind them, their prisoner, Regional Commander Vexthal of the Zerathi Third Fleet, shuffled along in restraints that were probably overkill but made everyone feel more professional about the whole kidnapping situation. I still can't believe they left their command transport parked outside with the keys in it, Finn said, patting the ship's hull with the affection usually reserved for reliable pets. Either they're the most trusting military force in the galaxy, or they're used to operating in areas where no one would dare steal their lunch money. Echo's mandibles clicked with residual amusement. The computer systems weren't even encrypted. Their operational security makes a children's playground look like a maximum security detention facility. General Hadrick stood at the bay entrance, his scales cycling through colors that hadn't been seen since the last time someone had explained to him that his tactical genius might be somewhat overstated. His expression suggested he was experiencing the particular kind of cognitive dissonance that occurred when reality refused to conform to carefully laid plans. "Lieutenant," he said, his voice carrying the strained quality of someone trying to process information that didn't fit his worldview. "You were ordered to conduct reconnaissance, solo reconnaissance, of a heavily fortified enemy position." "Yes, sir," the lieutenant replied with the bland professionalism of someone delivering a status report. "Mission accomplished. We've gathered extensive intelligence on enemy capabilities, strategic planning and operational parameters. You were supposed to die," Hadrix continued, apparently feeling that direct honesty was the appropriate response to having his assassination attempt turned into a public relations nightmare. "The mission parameters were calculated to ensure definitive resolution of personnel issues," which was, the lieutenant reflected, probably the most honest thing he'd said since assuming command. It also happened to be exactly the kind of admission that military tribunals found fascinating when determining appropriate disciplinary actions for commanding officers. "Fortunately, sir," she said, "human tactical flexibility proved adequate to the challenge, along with the exceptional capabilities of my team, who chose to accompany me despite the obvious risk." Behind her, Regional Commander Vexthal made a sound that his translator rendered as disgusted resignation. "Your species," he said, addressing the lieutenant with the tone of someone explaining particle physics to a particularly dim child, "approaches warfare like deranged amateur entertainers. No proper formation discipline, no adherence to established tactical doctrine, no respect for the conventional wisdom that has governed military operations for millennia." "Thank you, sir," the lieutenant replied. "We'll take that as a compliment." "It wasn't intended as one," the Zerathi commander continued, his forearms gesturing with the kind of emphasis that suggested he was still processing his own capture. "Your assault on our facility violated every principle of military science. You approached from impossible angles, used terrain features as weapons, and coordinated your attack through methods that shouldn't work according to any rational tactical analysis. And yet," Whisper observed with mental smugness that radiated through the landing bay like heat from a reactor, "here we are, alive, successful, and in possession of your entire strategic database." General Hadrix's scales had settled into a sickly yellow color that suggested he was beginning to understand the full implications of his failed disposal attempt. The lieutenant had returned not only alive but victorious, with intelligence that would reshape the entire sector's strategic situation. Worse, she'd done it with a mixed species team that had demonstrated exactly the kind of tactical innovation the GDC desperately needed. The kind of innovation that made generals like Hadrix look like evolutionary dead ends with impressive uniforms. "The prisoner requires immediate debriefing," he said, reaching for procedural authority like a drowning man grasping for debris. "And your team will need extensive analysis to determine how standard reconnaissance protocols were modified." "Actually, sir," the lieutenant said, producing a datapad with the casual precision of someone who'd been anticipating this conversation, "the prisoner has already provided extensive cooperation. The intelligence package includes fleet movements, supply line vulnerabilities, and strategic planning documents that Intelligence Division will find quite illuminating." She paused, studying Hadrix's expression with the clinical interest of someone watching a small animal realize it was being observed by a larger predator. There's also communications traffic suggesting coordination between Zarathi forces and certain elements within the GDC command structure. The landing bay fell silent except for the ambient hum of life support systems and General Hadrix's increasingly labored breathing. Around the perimeter, other personnel had begun to gather, junior officers, enlisted specialists, the kind of people who understood that something significant was happening even if they couldn't quite identify what. Furthermore, the lieutenant continued, several human units have submitted transfer requests. Apparently word has spread about our tactical methodologies. They're interested in serving under command that appreciates human capabilities, rather than treating them as expendable resources. Which was, Hadrix realized with growing horror, exactly the kind of development that would attract attention from higher command level. The kind of attention that involved uncomfortable questions about personnel management, tactical effectiveness, and why human units were performing better under officers who weren't actively trying to eliminate them. Your promotion to captain is effective immediately, came a voice from the bay entrance. Admiral Kethver, the sector commander, approached with the measured pace of someone who'd been monitoring the situation from a safe distance and had decided the political winds were shifting. Along with command of the new Human Integration Battalion, apparently there's significant interest in expanding these unconventional tactical approaches. The lieutenant accepted the promotion with the same professional calm she'd shown while infiltrating an impossible fortress and accidentally capturing an enemy command structure. Around her, her team maintained the respectful attention of soldiers who understood they'd just witnessed their commanding officer survive the most dangerous enemy of all, military politics. "Thank you, sir," she said. "I look forward to demonstrating what properly supported human units can accomplish when given appropriate objectives." General Hadrix stood frozen in the kind of paralysis that occurred when someone realized they'd not only failed to solve a problem, but had actually made it significantly worse. His attempt to dispose of a troublesome human officer had instead created exactly the kind of success story that would be studied in military academies for generations. The kind of story that would raise uncomfortable questions about how many other personnel problems might actually be tactical assets in disguise. As the landing bay cleared and the immediate crisis transformed into routine administrative processing, the lieutenant found herself reflecting on the peculiar trajectory that had brought her from death sentence to promotion in the span of 48 hours. It was, she realized, exactly the kind of improbable outcome that occurred when institutional incompetence met human stubbornness. General Hadrix had sent her on a suicide mission expecting to solve his human problem permanently. Instead, he'd inadvertently created the template for human tactical integration, and guaranteed that every competent human officer in the sector would now be requesting transfers to units that appreciated their capability. The galaxy, it seemed, was about to discover that trying to dispose of humans often produced exactly the opposite result. And somewhere in the administrative offices of the GDC, personnel managers were beginning to realize that their expendable resources might actually be their most valuable strategic asset. After all, any species stubborn enough to turn a suicide mission into a promotion opportunity was probably worth keeping around.